very warm welcome to this week's vlog, and today we're going to dive in and explore photographing the flight of small birds or passerines. Now, if you've attempted to capture these busy, colourful birds as they take flight, you'll know just how difficult a task this is. My experience has left me with many empty frames and a parting wave of a wing at the edge of the frame as the bird exits the scene. Simply put, when a small fast bird such as a blue tit or goldfinch flies and we try to take a photo as it's taking flight, the chain of communication between our eye and our index finger to press that shutter release, it's about 0.3 seconds. A blue tit can easily cover 3 to 5 meters in that time. Now, we may have a perception that our reaction times are instantaneous, but for the job in hand, they're just far too slow. So if you've managed to take a photo of a small bird in flight, maybe luck played a part. To counter our slow reaction times, camera manufacturers have implemented a smart function called, amongst other names, pre-release capture, and that's for Nikon cameras. Canon's version is called pre-continuous shooting. Fuji, pre-shot ES, Olympus, Pro Capture, Sony, pre-capture, Panasonic, pre-burst. The functionality is basically the same across all camera manufacturers. Now, essentially, the camera continually shoots images without the photographer fully pressing the shutter release. And it saves those images to the camera's temporary memory or buffer, not to the external SD card. The latest images in the buffer are continually overwritten in chronological order and replaced with the current images. So the process is iterative, so long as the photographer half presses the shutter release. The magic happens when we fully press the shutter release. Then, and only then, does the camera copy the set portion of the buffer memory onto the SD card, and miraculously we have taken photographs of events in the past, namely the flight of the bird. Now, it all sounds quite simple and straightforward, but there's other considerations that make this type of photography quite challenging. As I'm a Nikon user, I'll explain the details of the process based on the Nikon Z8, but the function also exists on the Z9, the Z6 III and the ZF, and other cameras as already mentioned. So let's break down aspects of Nikon's pre-capture. First up, the buffer length is measured in time. We've 3 options: 1 second, a half a second, and about 1/3 of a second worth of images. The minimum amount of frames per second is 30, then 60, and finally a whopping 120 frames per second. I've found 30 frames per second works for me, as it reduces the time to remove unwanted frames in post. I've selected 1 second of buffer time initially to give me a broad selection of frames. Now, the Z8 doesn't offer raw shooting with pre-release capture. Instead, the images are only available in JPEG. I found the most convenient way to access the pre-release function is to set it up in the info panel. Once set to on, you're ready to go. A green dot displayed beside the pre-icon in the viewfinder will confirm that when you half press the shutter release, the camera is buffering. Now, with regards to technique in the field, I've experimented with 2 options. The traditional method to photograph small birds in flight is to position a feeder on one upright and fix a second upright for perching close by. Then you can position the camera lens at a right angle to the line between the 2 posts. We can place some twine between the posts, focus on that point, and switch to manual focus. Now we know that if a bird lands on the perch and flies in a straight line to the feeder, it will be in focus as we trigger the release. Unfortunately, I have so many branches, trees and shrubs in my garden that when I tried this, it failed. Birds only occasionally landed on the perch. The second option, and this worked best for me, was to wait for the bird to land on the feeder. Using a large custom autofocus area and continuous autofocus on the feeding bird. I keep the bird to the edge of the autofocus area, hoping that it will fly to the opposite side and that the autofocus would lock on as the bird flies. This provides a large space of what essentially is bokeh for the bird to fly into, and it removes the bird feeder from the image. I also found that the best images are as the bird enters full flight mode, and that's after it takes flight, about 6 inches to a foot away from the feeder. So we need that feeder at the very edge of the frame and the wide area autofocus to ensure the camera is locking onto the bird at the very edge of the frame. And as the bird flies to the right or to the left into the space, we're hoping that the autofocus will follow it in. Now, the JPEG limitation of Nikon's pre-capture function makes it all the more important to ensure your exposure, camera profile, and also temperature are considered in camera. For example, setting a vivid profile will add extra contrast into the image, thereby darkening our shadows, brightening our highlights, and this increases the risk associated with any exposure anomalies. Remember that these settings are baked into the JPEG, and exposure corrections are quite limiting with a JPEG, particularly when compared to the flexibility we get from a RAW file. I was genuinely surprised at just how fragile or brittle the JPEG was when it came to even minor adjustments in post. For example, even increasing the exposure in post-processing or a light touch curves contrast adjustment layer really stretched the image. This, combined with high ISO, brought home the dilemma of setting exposure through aperture and shutter speed to control noise to a tolerable level. About 6400 ISO is, workable, but many images taken were beyond this. Additionally, having the subject as close as possible to the camera is important, as this reduces the need for cropping. Now, I positioned the camera, that's a 400mm 2.8, in full frame mode so that the feeder just about fits vertically in the frame. I also found, as you'd expect, that the autofocus locks onto the bird's eye better when the bird is larger in the frame. Now, this has the disadvantage of leaving less space for the bird to fly into. So I managed this dilemma by switching between full frame and DX or Nikon crop mode. Although JPEGs reduce the storage required, shooting in pre-capture produces many files that should be deleted as soon as possible. Once loaded into Lightroom, I browse quickly through all files. I mark potential candidates for further review with 1 star. Then I filter by unrated, select all and delete from disk. The next step is to purge more files by selecting only those files that we're going to process. There's a dilemma related to light when shooting birds in flight. On the one hand, we need as much light as possible in order to shoot at a fast shutter speed. However, we do not want direct sunlight due to the reflective nature of bills and eyes, possibly the background. This tends to result in very high contrast images and risks blowing out highlights and creates darker shadows. So ideally, we want soft light, softly lit backgrounds, that's morning light or late afternoon light on a partially clouded sky. Or alternatively, we can shoot all day on an overcast day. Now, in the past 2 to 3 days, in which I've spent a few hours in the hide on each day, it has been overcast and grey and dark and rainy. So whilst the light has been even and soft, the light levels have been very low. Obviously, aperture controls the light allowed into our cameras. Initially, I set the aperture closed up to about f5.6. But the ISO was just far too high, so over 10,000, and it's on an overcast day. So I decided to open up fully to 2.8 or maybe stop down to 3.5. With close-up bird photography, even at a closed down aperture, the whole bird is unlikely to be in focus. The most important part of the bird that we need in focus is the eye. If the eye is out of focus at 2.8 or 5.6 or f8, it's still soft. The softness will be less noticeable at f8, but it's likely to be soft, and we don't want that. As such, there is no good reason to shoot close down at say f8. Now you may disagree with me on this, but that was my experience, and this approach managed the high ISO effectively. For example, just after the sun rises is when we get the richest light of the day. In my garden, the ISO was through the roof at 20,000, that's shooting at f5.6. Opening up to 3.5 or 2.8 brought the ISO to an acceptable level at 6,400. And opening up the aperture also creates a much more pleasing bokeh and more painterly images. And that's what I regularly strive towards. So the next challenge is autofocus at the camera, and how good is the autofocus tracking on the Z8? Is it fast enough to track and lock on to these little Spitfires as they take flight? And the speed of these birds, as I've mentioned, is lightning fast. Some are quicker than others, generally depending on the size. I've found the smaller, the faster. Robins are relatively slow. Goldfinches, a little faster. Blue tits, faster again. And siskins are like miniature rockets. Here we see the autofocus in video mode continually latch on to the bird when feeding, and generally stationary. But just look what happens when the bird flies. The autofocus tries to follow and find, but it just can't keep up. The light was poor when shooting this clip, and as you would expect, autofocus does improve with higher levels of light. Now, as with all wildlife photography, the background and of course light, as we've already discussed, is as important as the subject. It goes without saying that we don't want a bird feeder or a shed or a kayak in the image. That's if we're photographing in the garden, which I have been doing. Now, at this time of year in the Northern Hemisphere, birds are coming into the breeding season, and the plumages of some birds are just pristine. So if you encounter a bird that's just not looking good, don't take an image of it. Rather, select a better specimen. It'll make a better photo. Let's talk about the background to your planned image. Pick an area that's not too dark and distracting. Set your camera up at the height you expect your bird to be photographed at, and look at the results. Now, as mentioned, opening up the aperture will create a better bokeh and diffuse a messy background of twigs and bushes. This also serves to separate the bird from the background. Here's a demonstration of the impact of bokeh in separating the bird from the background. In my garden, there's about 10 to 15 yards of distance between the feeder and the shrubs behind it. Now, as we close down the aperture, the birds become less distinct in the frame, and that pastel soft background achieved at a more open aperture gradually turns to a busy and less pleasing background. I've used a small pop-up hide in the garden to ensure that both myself and the birds are comfortable with the setup. The hide was placed so that at 400mm the feeders just about fit in the frame, thereby ensuring we have space to work the birds, to find them in the frame, and also that cropping is left to a minimum. That's the great advantage of working in a garden. We can control so many variables. Now, I set out to capture simple but beautiful and painterly images of birds in flight. As you may expect, once you start out on a mini photographic project like this, the first images tend to be less than expected, and thoughts of giving up may be entertained. Don't give up. As you experiment with different camera settings and become attuned to the movement of the birds, perseverance and a little luck will result in a few images that make the exercise worthwhile. And even if we fail to capture any images, to listen to the sound of the birds flying in, the calls, the quarrels they have, it's a little piece of winter magic that we can all enjoy. So before I leave you with a selection of the images taken in the last few days, I hope you found the vlog informative and enjoyable. If you have, please do subscribe, comment and like. Until next time, thanks very much for watching.